My daughter accidentally sent me a voice message meant for her husband. She said, "I can't stand this useless old hag anymore. Soon she'll be taking her final nap and will be spending all her money in Paris." My blood froze, so I made one phone call to my friend. I said to him, "Put our plan into action. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. My name is Vivian, and for 52 years the walls of this house have been the silent keepers of my story. They have absorbed the echoes of my husband Robert's deep laughter, the frantic patter of my children's feet, and in the 7 years since Robert's passing, the profound and ordered silence of my own quiet life. My world had become a curated collection of small joys, the heft of my late husband's silver in my hands, as I polished it, the earthy scent of my rose garden after a rain, the weekly ritual of a phone call with my daughter Amelia. It was a small world, a peaceful one. I did not realize it was also a besieged kingdom, and that the enemy was already inside the gates. The invasion began not with a battering ram but with a simple digital chime. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of still sun-drenched day that feels heavy with memory. I was in the sitting room, a half-finished cup of tea growing cold beside me, listening to a Brahms intermezzo on the radio. My phone, a sleek, complicated device Julian had insisted I get, buzzed on the table. A notification glowed on the screen. New voice message from Amelia. I smiled. Perhaps she was calling about the charity luncheon on Saturday. I tapped the screen, raising the phone to my ear. There was a brief fumbling sound, a rustle of fabric, and then my daughter's voice filled the silence. But it was not her voice for me, the one that was all sweetness and light. This was a voice I had never heard before, a voice sharp and ugly with a contempt that was breathtaking in its casual cruelty. "I can't stand this useless old hag anymore," she spat. The words meant for her husband Julian. "He wants to wait, to be careful." "I can't be careful. We're out of time. Soon she'll be taking her final nap and will be spending all her money in Paris." The world did not stop. The Brahms continued to play, a tragic, beautiful counterpoint to the ugliness that had just been mainlined into my ear. But the blood in my veins seemed to turn to ice water. My hand was so steady it felt disconnected from my body as I lowered the phone. The teacup rattled in its saucer as a tremor finally overtook me. A useless old hag, her final nap, Paris. The words were small, sharp daggers, and they had found their home deep in my heart. But beneath the initial shocking wave of pain, something else rose up, something cold and hard and unfamiliar. It was not fear, it was not helplessness, it was a grim crystalline certainty. For months, I had been battling a creeping sense of unease, a feeling I had dismissed as the lonely paranoia of an old woman. Amelia's cloying, over-the-top affection, Julian's charming, yet hollow deference, their constant subtle questions about my will, my investments, my health. I had chided myself for my suspicions, for my lack of faith in my own child. I had been wrong to doubt myself. My instincts had been right all along. The voice message was not a revelation. It was a confirmation. And because my dear Robert had known the world, and because he had loved me with a fierce, protective foresight, I was not unarmed. I was not a victim waiting for the axe to fall. I stood up, my movements deliberate, and walked to the antique secretary desk in the corner. I did not cry. The time for tears would come later. This was a time for action. I took out a small, unassuming address book, and flipped to a single finger under V. I picked up the landline, its familiar weight a comfort in my hand, and dialed the number. He answered on the second ring, his voice as calm and reliable as it had been for the past 50 years. "Arthur Vance speaking." "Arthur," I said, and I was pleased to find my own voice was as steady as his. "It's Vivian." "Vivian," he said, and I could hear the immediate shift in his tone from professional to concerned. "Is everything all right?" "It's happening," I said, the words falling like stones into the quiet room. "The contingency we discussed, it's time." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, the silence of a loyal soldier receiving his orders. "Put our plan into action." "Understood," he said, his voice now grim with purpose. "I'll make the calls. Are you safe?" "For now," I replied. "They think I'm a fool. Let's not disabuse them of that notion just yet." I hung up the phone. Outside, a bird sang in the jacaranda tree. The Brahms on the radio swelled to a crescendo. My world looked exactly the same as it had 5 minutes ago, but it was irrevocably, terrifyingly different. The quiet house was no longer a sanctuary, It was a battlefield. My role as a loving mother was over. My new role as the architect of my daughter's downfall had just begun. Minutes after I hung up with Arthur, my phone rang again. I glanced at the screen. The name Amelia glowed with a new, sinister light. This was it, the first test of my new reality. I took a deep, steadying breath, consciously relaxing the muscles in my face, and tried to summon the woman I had been just 10 minutes ago, a slightly frail, loving mother, perhaps a bit confused by modern technology. I let the phone ring 3 times before answering, my hand intentionally fumbling with the button. "Hello?" I said, pitching my voice a little higher, a little weaker. "Mommy, oh thank God you answered." Amelia's voice was a frantic, breathless performance of relief. "My phone is being so weird. I think it might have accidentally sent you a garbled voice message or something. It was just pocket noise. Did you get anything?" I held the phone slightly away from my ear, imagining her on the other end, her heart likely pounding, not with fear for me, but with fear of being caught. "A voice message," I said, injecting a note of befuddlement into my tone. "Oh dear, these new phones are so complicated." "No, I don't think anything came through. Was it important?" Inside, a cold, analytical part of my brain was taking notes. She hadn't started with an apology or an explanation. She had started by trying to gauge what I knew. She was testing the waters. "No, not at all," she said, laughing a brittle, unconvincing laugh. "It was nothing. Julian and I were just talking about our trip to Paris, and the phone was in my purse. You know how it is." Paris. The casual mention of the city was a deliberate, cruel twist of the knife, designed to be a private joke between her and her husband. I felt a fresh surge of cold fury, but I kept my voice placid. "Paris. How lovely, dear. You must be so excited." "We are," she said, the relief in her voice now palpable. She believed her lie had landed. She believed I was still the sweet, oblivious old woman she could so easily manipulate. "Listen, Mom. We were just talking about you. We're so worried about you being all alone in that big house. We're going to pop over this evening. Maybe bring some dinner. We need to talk more about that investment idea Julian had, the one to make sure you're secure." To make sure I was secure? The hypocrisy was so profound it was almost elegant. They were coming to advance their plot, to continue the slow, methodical process of stripping me of my autonomy and my assets, all under the guise of loving concern. "That would be lovely, dear," I said, my voice warm. "You know I love your company." "Great. We'll see you around 7, she chirped, and hung up. The moment the line went dead, the mask of the doddering mother dropped. I stood in the center of my silent living room, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. The performance had been exhausting, a high-wire act of emotional suppression. I had to maintain this facade for days, perhaps weeks, living a lie in my own home, smiling at the daughter who was actively plotting my demise. I walked through the house, my house, the place Robert and I had filled with a lifetime of love and memories. I ran a hand over the worn velvet of his favorite armchair. I looked at the gallery of family photos on the wall. There was Amelia as a gap-toothed 7-year-old, beaming with pride on her first day of school. There she was as a teenager, beautiful and sullen in her prom dress. There she was on her wedding day, a radiant bride on the arm of a smiling, charming Julian. A wave of grief so profound it almost buckled my knees, washed over me. This was the second time I had lost my daughter. The first loss had been gradual and slow drifting away that had begun when Julian entered her life. She had become more distant, more materialistic, her values shifting from the ones I had tried to instill in her to the shallow, grasping ones of her ambitious husband. But I had always held out hope, believing that the loving little girl in those photographs was still in there somewhere. The voice message had killed that hope. The daughter I had raised, the one I loved, was truly gone. In her place was a stranger, a cold, resentful woman who looked at me and saw not her mother but an obstacle. The tears I had suppressed earlier finally came. Hot and silent. I was not crying out of fear. I was mourning the death of my child. But as the tears subsided, they were replaced by that same cold, hard resolve. She had made her choice. She had declared war on me, on the memory of her father, on the very foundation of our family, and I, in turn, had made mine. I would not be a passive victim. I would not be a useless old hag taking her final nap. I would be a queen on my own chessboard, and I would protect my kingdom even if it meant sacrificing my own daughter to do it. The secure burner phone Arthur had given me months ago for this very contingency buzzed in my apron pocket. It was him. She called, I said, my voice now stripped of all its earlier feigned frailty. They're coming for dinner tonight. They're going to pitch the investment. As we predicted, Arthur's voice was calm and steady. A rock in my swirling sea of emotion. The plan is active, Vivian. The PI is in place. Mr. Graves. He's the best. He'll be watching the house tonight. The financial accounts are ready. The wiretaps we discussed are now live. From this moment on, every word they speak within these walls is being recorded. My home was no longer just a stage. It was a listening post. A trap? The thought was both terrifying and strangely comforting. Remember the script, Vivian, Arthur continued, his voice gentle but firm. You are the bait. Your role is the most difficult, and the most dangerous. You are a loving, slightly confused mother, grateful for their help. You must be convincing. Don't worry, Arthur, I said, my gaze falling on the photograph of my late husband on the mantelpiece. Robert looked back at me, his eyes full of the quiet strength I had always relied on. She taught me how to play this role herself. It's the one she's been playing with me for years. I thought of Robert and of Arthur, his oldest and most loyal friend. I remembered the day, a year after Robert's death, when Arthur had sat with me at my dining room table. He had been helping me consolidate my husband's complex portfolio. He had noticed my vague, unspoken anxieties about Julian's growing influence over Amelia. Robert always said the greatest threat to a legacy isn't a market crash. Arthur had told me, his eyes full of a shrewd worldly wisdom. It's a charming son-in-law with a taste for other people's money. It was then that he had proposed the plan. A series of legal and financial firewalls. A contingency strategy to protect me and the fortune Robert had spent his life building. We had created a complex trust, moved assets, and established a series of tripwires that could only be activated with a specific sequence of codes known only to Arthur and me. It had seemed at the time like an exercise in paranoia. Now it felt like a prophecy fulfilled. Robert's foresight, his deep, abiding love, was reaching out to me from beyond the grave, arming me for the battle to come. They'll be here at 7, I told Arthur, my voice now steady, and we'll be ready, he replied. Just remember, Vivian, you are not alone in this. I hung up the phone, the weight of the task ahead settling upon me. I was the bait in a trap of my own design. I had to be the frail, trusting mother, all while my mind raced with the cold calculations of a general. I had to smile at my daughter knowing she wished me dead. I had to endure her husband's false charm, knowing he was a predator circling his prey. My home was a stage, my life a performance, and the stakes were everything. The doorbell rang at precisely 7 o'clock. Punctuality, I thought with a grim irony, was a virtue they had mastered. I took one last deep breath, summoned the persona of the gentle, slightly doddering widow and went to answer the door. They stood on my porch, wreathed in the golden light of the setting sun, a perfect portrait of a loving family. Amelia held a bouquet of carnations, a cheap, thoughtless flower when she knew I adored orchids. Julian held a bottle of wine, a brand I recognized as one of the expensive ones he favored, a gift that was really for himself. Mommy, Amelia chirped, stepping forward to give me an airy theatrical kiss on the cheek. Her perfume was overpowering. You look wonderful, but you look tired. Have you been resting? I'm fine, dear, I said, allowing a slight tremor into my voice. Just a little weary today. See, this is what we're worried about, Julian said, his voice a deep, resonant performance of concern. He placed the wine on the hall table and put a hand on my arm, his touch proprietary. You're trying to do too much. That's why we're here, to help. They bustled into my home, their energy too loud, too bright for the quiet space. They made a show of fussing over me, of helping me in the kitchen as I prepared the simple meal I had made. It was all a carefully choreographed dance, and I followed their lead, playing my part. We sat down at my dining room table, the same table where we had celebrated countless birthdays and holidays. The conversation was all pleasant, empty chatter, but underneath the air was thick with unspoken intentions. Finally, as I served the dessert, Julian cleared his throat. The second act of the play was about to begin. Mom, he began, his tone shifting to one of serious, heartfelt sincerity. Amelia and I have been doing a lot of thinking. We are so impressed with how you've managed everything since Dad passed. But we think it's time you let us take some of that burden off your shoulders. He then launched into his pitch. It was a smooth, polished monologue about a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to invest in a new boutique hotel development in Napa Valley. He used a cascade of financial jargon: preferred equity, mezzanine financing, guaranteed high-yield returns, all designed to sound impressive and slightly confusing. He spoke of securing my future, of protecting my legacy, of making my money work for me. I listened, feigning a mixture of awe and bewilderment. I asked what I hoped were the right kind of silly questions. "Oh, that all sounds so complicated. Is it safe?" Robert was always so careful. "Completely safe," Julian said, his smile never faltering. "In fact, it's safer than letting your money sit in a low-interest savings account. With inflation, you're practically losing money every day. This is about being smart. It's what Robert would have wanted." The invocation of my husband's name was a vile, calculated move, and it took all my self-control not to flinch. "The only thing," Amelia chimed in, her voice soft and persuasive, "is that the opportunity is time-sensitive. The initial investment round closes at the end of next week. We'd need to move quickly." This was the hook. The manufactured urgency. I looked from my daughter's earnest, pleading face to my son-in-law's confident, charming one. They were a formidable team. They thought they were reeling me in, that my hesitation was the natural fear of an old woman out of her depth. I let the silence stretch for a long moment, making them wait. Finally, I let out a long, weary sigh. "It's a very big decision," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "You're right, it is a burden, handling all of this alone. I'll think about it. I'll need to speak to Miss Henderson at the bank, of course." The tiny, almost imperceptible glance that passed between them was my reward. It was a look of pure triumphant condescension. They had me. The foolish old woman was going to follow their script. As they were leaving, Amelia gave me another hug, this one tighter, more possessive. "You're doing the right thing, Mommy," she whispered in my ear. "You'll see, we'll take such good care of you." I closed the door behind them and leaned against it, my legs weak with the strain of the performance. I immediately went to my secure phone and called Arthur. "They took the bait," I said, my voice no longer frail but cold and hard as stone. The first report from Mr. Graves, the private investigator Arthur had hired, arrived 3 days later. It was not delivered to my home, but to a secure P.O. box Arthur had arranged. Clara, my daughter, had flown in and now acted as my trusted courier and confidant. She placed the plain manila envelope on my kitchen table, her face grim. "Are you sure you want to see this, Mom?" she asked, her voice gentle. "I have to," I replied. Seeing the truth, no matter how ugly, was the only way to arm myself for what was to come. The contents of the envelope were a cold, hard confirmation of my worst fears. Mr. Graves was a thorough professional. There were photographs, pages of detailed notes, and copies of public records. The first set of photos showed Julian, not at his downtown office, but in the parking lot of a seedy bar in an industrial part of town. His companion was a large, rough-looking man with a neck tattoo, a man Mr. Graves had identified as a known enforcer for a local loan shark. They weren't shaking hands, they were arguing. Julian's face in the grainy telephoto shot was a mask of pure, desperate fear. So this was the source of their urgency. It wasn't just about greed. It was about desperation. They were in trouble, the kind of trouble that couldn't be solved with a simple bank loan. The next pages detailed their financial ruin. Mr. Graves had uncovered a string of failed businesses, all under Vanessa's name, all funded by high-interest, predatory loans. There were multiple credit cards maxed out, a second mortgage on their house that was in default, and finally the foreclosure notice that had been served 2 weeks ago. They were not just on the verge of collapse, they were already falling. Seeing it all laid out in black and white was sickening, but it was also clarifying. Their charming suburban life was a complete and utter sham. The expensive cars, the designer clothes, the charity galas, it was all a stage set, and the creditors were about to tear it down. My money, my legacy, was not an investment opportunity. It was their only lifeline, and they were willing to kill me to get it. The report steeled my resolve. That afternoon, when Amelia called for her daily check-in, I was ready. I began the next phase of my own performance, the calculated decline. "Amelia, dear," I said, my voice sounding a little more distant, a little more reedy than the day before. "I was just looking for my gardening shears. Do you remember where I might have put them?" "They're in the shed, Mom," she said, a note of patronizing patience in her voice. "Where they always are." "Oh, of course," I said with a sigh. My mind is like a sieve these days. A few days later, during another call, I pretended to forget the name of my cousin in Florida. You know, Robert's niece, the one with the 2 little boys. What is her name again? Brenda. Mom? Amelia said, and I could almost hear the triumphant smirk in her voice. She would be reporting all of this back to Julian. The old woman is losing it. She's fading faster than we thought. It was a dangerous, demeaning game. Every feigned moment of confusion, every staged lapse of memory, felt like a small betrayal of myself, of the sharp, competent woman I had always been. I had to inhabit their caricature of me, to become the useless old hag from the voice message in order to make them feel safe, to lull them into a state of arrogant carelessness. The hardest part was seeing the effect my decline was having on my real friends and family. My son David called, his voice laced with a worried concern that was all too genuine. Clara tells me you're having some memory lapses. Mom, are you feeling all right? Should I come out for a visit? I had to lie to him, to the child who had done nothing wrong, and it felt like swallowing glass. No, David, I'm just a little tired. Your sister worries too much. I'm perfectly fine. Every lie was a small weight on my soul, but I knew it was necessary. I was weaving a web of my own, a web of perceived frailty and confusion, and Amelia and Julian, blinded by their greed and their own sense of superiority, were walking straight into the center of it, never suspecting that the fly they were stalking was in fact the spider. After a week of my carefully orchestrated performance of decline, I made the call they had been waiting for. I telephoned Amelia, my voice full of a weary resignation. Amelia, dear, I began with a sigh. I've been thinking about what you and Julian said, about the investment. And you're right. It's all too much for me to handle on my own. I'd like to move forward with it. I could hear a sharp intake of breath on her end of the line, the sound of a predator sensing victory. Oh, Mommy, that's wonderful, she gushed, her voice a symphony of false relief. You're making such a smart decision. Julian will be so pleased. I'll need to go to the bank, of course, I continued, sticking to the script Arthur and I had prepared. To arrange the transfer, could you and Julian take me on Friday? Of course we can, she said, her voice practically vibrating with excitement. We'll clear our schedules. Anything you need. The appointment was set. The bank we were going to was not my usual branch, but a larger one downtown. It was a branch where Arthur had a long-standing relationship with the manager, a woman named Ms. Albright, who had already been briefed on the situation. She was an integral part of our sting operation. On Friday morning they arrived at my house, their mood a stark contrast to the somber coercion of my last bank visit. They were giddy, electric with a triumphant energy. Vanessa was wearing a new expensive-looking dress, and Julian was whistling as he helped me into the car. They were already spending the money in their heads. The bank was a grand, imposing building with high ceilings and marble floors. We were not made to wait in line. Miss Albright greeted us personally, a coolly professional woman in her 50s. She led us to her private office, a spacious room with a large mahogany desk. Eleanor, so good to see you, she said, her voice warm but her eyes sharp and intelligent as she took in my companions. Arthur Vance has already spoken to me about your wishes. We have the preliminary paperwork ready. Julian took charge, his voice smooth and confident as he explained the nature of the investment. Ms. Albright listened patiently, nodding in all the right places. The entire scene was a piece of elaborate theater, and everyone was playing their part to perfection. The key to the sting was the money itself. The sum they wanted was substantial, enough to make them feel they had hit the jackpot. Arthur had arranged for this exact amount to be deposited into a new temporary account in my name. This account, the honey pot, was completely separate from my actual heavily protected trust. It was baked pure and simple, and every transaction from it was being meticulously and legally monitored by a forensic accounting team Arthur had hired. I signed the transfer authorization, my hand performing a convincing tremor. The document authorized the transfer of the funds from the honeypot account to a holding company Julian had created. The name of the company, as I saw on the papers, was Parisian Dreams, LLC. The sheer brazen arrogance of it was almost comical. As Miss Albright stamped the papers, I saw the look that passed between Amelia and Julian. It was a look of pure, unadulterated greed, a shared, silent celebration of their victory over the foolish old woman who had just signed her fortune away. They believed they had just tapped into my life savings. In reality, they had just signed their own confession. They had willingly and eagerly walked into the financial trap we had laid for them. The drive home was a blur of their cheerful, condescending chatter. They talked about all the ways they were going to take care of me now, how I wouldn't have to worry about a thing. It took every ounce of my self-control to sit in the back seat and nod along, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. As I got out of the car, Amelia gave me a hug, her arms wrapping around me in a gesture of false affection. "We're so proud of you, Mom," she whispered. "You were so brave today." I watched them drive away, their laughter echoing in the quiet suburban street. They thought they had won. They had no idea that the net we had been weaving for weeks had just been pulled tight around them. The weeks following the bank transfer were a masterclass in psychological warfare. My days were a tense, exhausting performance, while my nights were filled with updates from the front lines of our secret war. The contrast was dizzying. To Amelia and Julian I was a fading, compliant old woman, an obstacle that had been successfully managed. In reality I was the silent commander of an operation that was meticulously documenting their every move. The most disturbing piece of intelligence came from my friend, Martha. We were at our weekly bridge game, a small ritual of normalcy that had become my lifeline. As my partner was shuffling the cards, Martha leaned in close, her face a mask of worried concern. "Vivian, I don't want to alarm you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the snap of the cards, "but I had the strangest conversation with Amelia last week. She called me out of the blue just to chat, but she kept asking about you, about your health." My hand tightened on my cards. "What kind of questions?" I asked, keeping my voice even. "Strange questions," Martha said, her brow furrowed. "She wanted to know if you were still taking your heart medication, the one Dr. Evans prescribed. She asked if you ever got dizzy spells. She even asked if you had ever updated your will after Robert passed." It was morbid, Vivian. It didn't feel like concern. It felt like she was gathering information. I thanked Martha for her loyalty, my heart aching that Amelia's treachery was now a topic of whispered concern among my oldest friends. They were not just content with the money they had stolen, they were actively researching the mechanics of my demise. The final nap was not an idle, angry fantasy. It was a goal they were working towards. This news lent a new, terrifying weight to the next report from Mr. Graves. It arrived as usual via Clara. The envelope was thicker than usual. Inside, among the usual surveillance photos, were copies of receipts. They were from an online chemical supply store, a business that sold laboratory-grade compounds to research facilities. The purchases had been made with a prepaid credit card, and shipped to a P.O. box Julian had opened under a false name. The item purchased was a large quantity of a specific potent potassium supplement. Arthur had already had a pharmacist friend analyze the purchase. The compound was chemically identical to the primary ingredient in my prescribed heart medication. In small, controlled doses it regulated my heartbeat. In a large, uncontrolled dose, Arthur's contact had explained, it would trigger a massive, untraceable cardiac arrest. I stared at the receipts, the clinical typed words, a death sentence in triplicate. The phone call with Arthur was grim. "Vivian," he said, his voice stripped of its usual calm, now low and urgent. "Effective immediately. You do not eat or drink a single thing they prepare for you. Not a cup of tea, not a cookie, not a glass of water. Is that understood? Your house is no longer safe when they are in it." The threat was no longer a distant, abstract concept. It was here. It was a vial of white powder. It was a doctored cup of tea. It was my own daughter's hand, serving me my death. My performance had to become even more convincing. I had to continue to welcome them into my home, to sit at my table and share a meal with them, all while knowing they were actively plotting to murder me. Every bite of the food I had prepared for myself felt like a victory. Every sip of water from a bottle I had opened myself a small act of defiance. The fear was a constant, cold companion. I found myself checking the locks on my doors obsessively. Every creak of the old house at night would send a jolt of adrenaline through me. I was a prisoner in my own fortified home. But fear was a luxury I could not afford. It had to be secondary to the plan. I channeled the terror into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. They had underestimated me. They saw a frail old woman, an easy target. They did not see the daughter of a sharecropper who had seen real hardship, the widow of a brilliant man who had taught me the art of strategy, the mother who would burn the world down to protect the legacy of her family. They thought they were the predators, but the trap was set, the evidence was mounting, and my patience, unlike my love for them, was not infinite. Their failed attempt to hasten my final nap was both pathetic and terrifying. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. I had told them I was feeling unwell, and was going to lie down for the afternoon. A piece of bait I knew they would find irresistible. As I had predicted, Amelia called mid-afternoon. "Just checking on you, Mommy," she chirped. "We're so worried. Julian and I are going to pop over for a few minutes to drop off some soup." "That's so thoughtful, dear," I murmured, my voice weak and sleepy. "But don't wake me if I'm sleeping. Just leave it on the porch." From my upstairs window I watched them arrive. Mr. Graves, the PI, was parked across the street in an unremarkable sedan, a long-lensed camera documenting their every move. They didn't leave the soup on the porch. Julian used the emergency key I had foolishly given them years ago. They were inside my house for less than 5 minutes before they re-emerged, got in their car and drove away. I waited a full 10 minutes before I went downstairs. The house was silent. A container of soup sat on the kitchen counter, but a new smell hung in the air. A faint, acrid scent that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was the smell of natural gas. I walked slowly to the kitchen, the pilot light on my old gas stove, a flame that had burned continuously for 30 years, was out. One of the burner knobs had been turned ever so slightly, allowing a slow, steady hiss of gas to seep into the room. It was a cowardly, amateurish attempt. They had likely hoped that the gas would accumulate, and that a single spark from the refrigerator cycling on, from the thermostat, from me flipping a light switch would cause an explosion. They could then play the part of the grieving children, shocked and devastated by their mother's tragic accident. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was rage, pure and undiluted. I opened all the windows, the fresh air a welcome relief. I did not relight the stove. I left it as it was, a silent, damning piece of evidence. I immediately called Arthur. "They were here," I said, my voice tight. "They tried to blow up the house." Arthur's reaction was grim. "The PI has them on camera entering and leaving. We have the timestamp. Vivian, this is the end game. They're getting desperate. The doctor's visit is next." Their failure had indeed made them reckless. The next day, Amelia called, her voice a performance of frantic loving concern. "Mom, I'm so glad I reached you. I was talking to a friend, and she told me about this incredible new cardiologist, a real miracle worker. He specializes in geriatric care. I made you an appointment. We have to go. I won't take no for an answer." The goal was transparently obvious. Their own doctor, a man who had treated me for 20 years and knew I was as healthy as a horse for my age, would never declare me incompetent or sign off on any suspicious changes to my medication. They needed a new doctor, their doctor a hired gun who could be persuaded to create a medical narrative that suited their legal one. "Oh, Amelia, I don't know," I said, playing my part. "Dr. Evans knows me so well." "He's old-fashioned, Mom," she insisted. "This new doctor is on the cutting edge. Please, do it for me. For my peace of mind." On Arthur's advice, I agreed. The appointment was in 2 days. The night before, Arthur came to the house. He brought with him a small, incredibly discreet device. It was a brooch, an elegant silver leaf, the kind I often wore on my coat. Embedded within it was a high-fidelity audio recorder. "They will likely try to separate you from Julian and speak with the doctor alone," Arthur explained as he showed me how to activate it with a simple touch. "This is our only way of being in that room with you. Be careful, Vivian. You'll be in the lion's den." I pinned the brooch to my lapel, the metal cold against my skin. The next day, as Julian and Amelia drove me to the unfamiliar medical clinic in a distant suburb, I felt a strange sense of calm. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was overshadowed by a feeling of profound righteous purpose. They thought they were leading a lamb to the slaughter. They had no idea they were walking into the final crucial phase of a meticulously documented sting. The final piece of the puzzle, the one that would transform their monstrous plot from a family matter into a federal crime, came from Arthur's forensic accountant. While I was preparing for my performance at the doctor's office, the accountant was tracking the money. The large sum I had transferred from the honeypot account had not been invested in any Napa Valley hotel. The holding company, Parisian Dreams LLC, was a phantom, a shell corporation with no assets and no business activity. The day after I made the transfer, the money had begun to move. Arthur laid out the charts for me when I returned from the doctor's visit, and they told a story of frantic criminal activity. The money had been wired from the holding company to a second, then a third, each one registered in a different state. From there it had been broken into smaller sums and finally, funneled into a single, offshore account in the Cayman Islands, an account that was solely in Julian's name. It's a classic money laundering scheme, Arthur explained, his voice grim. He was trying to make the money untraceable, to hide it from the creditors who are closing in on him, and by moving it offshore he was committing wire fraud, a federal offense. He's no longer just a greedy son-in-law, Vivian, he's a bona fide criminal. This was the final nail in their coffin. We now had a complete unbroken chain of evidence. We had the voice message, proving their intent. We had the surveillance from the PI, documenting their suspicious activities. We had the receipts for the poison. We had the documentation of the attempted accident. And now we had irrefutable bank-to-bank proof of grand larceny and wire fraud. My own trip to the doctor had been exactly what we expected. The specialist was a slick, vaguely reptilian man who asked me leading questions about my memory and suggested a battery of unnecessary and expensive tests. Amelia had insisted on speaking with him alone, and the tiny brooch on my lapel had recorded every word. It captured her painting a picture of my advanced dementia, her lies about my frequent falls and paranoid episodes, and her request that the doctor consider prescribing a new, stronger sedative to help me rest. It was a clear, recorded attempt to build a fraudulent medical record to support her competency hearing and perhaps to facilitate the final nap she so desperately wanted from me. That night, sitting with Arthur and Clara, we reviewed our arsenal. We had everything we needed. Every lie they had told, every crime they had committed, was now documented, recorded, and ready to be presented. The net we had so carefully woven was now complete. All that was left was to choose the time and place to draw it tight. They're planning to file the competency petition next week, Arthur said, his voice low and strategic. They think the fraudulent doctor's report will be their checkmate. Then we need to move before they do, I said, a cold, hard clarity in my voice. We need to end this, on our terms, in our time. A plan formed in my mind, a final fitting piece of theater. I'm going to call them, I announced. I'm going to tell them that I've had a change of heart, that I've decided to give them everything. I'm going to tell them I want to sign the full power of attorney. I'll invite them to dinner, here tomorrow night to celebrate a new chapter for the family. Clara looked at me, her eyes wide with alarm. Mom, you can't have them in the house again after what they tried to do. Yes, I can, I said, my voice firm. It's the only way. They need to feel completely victorious, completely safe. They need to walk into this house believing they have won. It's the only way to ensure they won't see the trap until it's already sprung. Arthur looked at me, a long, appraising look. He saw not a frightened old woman, but a fellow strategist. He gave a single, slow nod of approval. Checkmate, he said. The stage was set for the final act. I made the call the next morning. My performance was, if I do say so myself, my most convincing yet. My voice was a quavering, emotional wreck. I told Amelia I was tired of fighting, tired of being a burden. I told her that my visit to the new doctor had made me realize how much I was declining, how much I needed their help. I want to sign the papers, Amelia, I sobbed into the phone. All of them. The power of attorney, whatever you and Julian think is best. I trust you. I want you to handle everything. The silence on the other end of the line was thick with her stunned, triumphant disbelief. Oh, Mommy, she finally breathed, her voice a syrupy concoction of fake sympathy and real greed. You're being so brave, you're doing the right thing. We will take such good care of you. Come for dinner tonight, I said, my voice catching. We can sign the papers then. We can celebrate a new chapter for our family. We'll be there, she promised, barely able to contain the excitement in her voice. The day was a blur of quiet, meticulous preparation. Arthur handled the logistics, coordinating with Officer Diaz and her team. Clara was my rock, her calm, steady presence a shield against my own frayed nerves. We cooked a simple, elegant meal. A roast chicken, the way I used to make it for Amelia when she was a little girl. Every mundane act, from peeling the potatoes to setting the table with my best silver, felt heavy with a terrible final significance. They arrived at 7, just as they had on that first night. But this time their energy was different. It was not the tense, grasping energy of predators on the hunt. It was the giddy, expansive energy of victors dividing the spoils. They were radiant with success. Julian presented me with a bottle of vintage champagne, and Amelia gave me a soft cashmere shawl. The gifts felt like offerings at the altar of my surrender. The dinner was a masterpiece of surreal tension. They were effusive, full of plans for their upcoming trip to Paris, for the renovations they were planning for our house, for the wonderful new assisted living facility they had found for me, a place where I would be so comfortable. They spoke of my future as if I were a piece of furniture to be conveniently stored. I smiled. I nodded. I played the part of the relieved, compliant mother to the very end. Finally, as Clara cleared the dessert plates, Julian produced a sleek leather briefcase. He clicked it open and pulled out a thick stack of documents. It was the power of attorney along with several other forms I didn't recognize. "Just a few signatures, Mom, and it's all done," he said, his smile wide and predatory. He slid the papers and a pen across the polished surface of my dining room table. This was the moment. I looked at the papers. I looked at my daughter's eager, greedy face. I looked at my son-in-law's triumphant smirk. The image of the loving family was complete. A perfect, horrifying lie. I put down my fork. I folded my hands on the table in front of me. The frail, confused persona I had worn for weeks fell away, and my voice when I spoke was as clear and cold as a winter morning. "Before we sign anything," I said, my gaze meeting theirs without a flicker of fear, "I believe we have some things to discuss." The smiles on their faces faltered, replaced by a look of sudden confused alarm. On cue, a door from the kitchen swung open. It was not Clara. It was Arthur Vance. He was dressed in a dark suit, his face grim and resolute. He walked to the dining room table and placed a thick, legal-sized file on the polished wood. It landed with a soft, heavy thud that seemed to echo in the sudden dead silence of the room. "Emilia, Julian," Arthur said, his voice like ice. "Let's review your recent activities." He opened the file. The first things he slid across the table were the glossy 8x10 surveillance photos. The first showed Julian in the parking lot with the loan shark. The next, a close-up of the foreclosure notice on their front door. The next, the receipts for the potassium compound. Emilia's face went white. Julian looked like he was going to be physically ill. "We have a great deal to discuss," Arthur continued, his voice relentless. "The fraudulent wire transfer of your mother's money, the untraceable P.O. box, the purchase of a lethal quantity of a controlled substance, and of course the attempted murder via the gas stove, which your friendly private investigator Mr. Graves documented from across the street." They sat in stunned, horrified silence. The trap sprung so suddenly and so completely they couldn't even process it. Emilia stared at me, her mouth opening and closing silently, her eyes wide with a mixture of hatred and pure unadulterated shock. Julian had buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. "And then there's this," I said, my own voice cutting through the silence. I placed the small silver brooch on the table and pressed a button. A recording began to play. My conversation with the specialist they had hired. Emilia's voice filled the room, confidently telling the doctor about my advanced dementia and my paranoid episodes. It was at that moment, as her own lies echoed in the quiet dining room, that the doorbell rang. "I'll get it," Arthur said calmly. He walked to the front hall and opened the door. Standing on my porch silhouetted against the dark night were Officer Diaz and her partner. Their presence was quiet, professional, and absolutely final. The sting was complete. My daughter and son-in-law, who had come to my house for a celebration, found themselves in handcuffs at my dining room table. Their dreams of Paris dissolved into the harsh, fluorescent reality of the back of a squad car. As they were led away, Emilia looked at me one last time, her face a contorted mask of disbelief and pure venomous hatred. I met her gaze, my own expression calm and unyielding. The game was over. I had won. Months later, the legal storm has passed. The trial was a quiet procedural affair, not the dramatic spectacle I had feared. With the mountain of evidence Arthur and I had collected, the outcome was never in doubt. The voice message, the financial records, the PI's testimony, the recording from the doctor's office, it was an open and shut case. Emilia and Julian are in prison now. The sentences were long. Their crimes were not just theft and conspiracy, but attempted murder. The judge was particularly scathing in his assessment of their calculated, cold-blooded cruelty towards a family member. Their faces, pale and drawn, are seared into my memory from the day of the sentencing. They were no longer the confident, arrogant predators I had known, but two broken, pathetic people, finally facing the consequences of their own rotten souls. With the help of Clara and my son David, I am slowly rebuilding a tentative, supervised relationship with my grandchildren. Thomas and Lily are in therapy, trying to process the incomprehensible truth that their parents are not on a long trip, but are in prison for trying to harm their grandmother. It is a slow, painful process, but their resilience, their childish capacity for love and forgiveness, is a constant source of wonder to me. They are the true legacy I am fighting to protect. The story ends not in that silent, violated dining room but here, 6 months later, on a bright, crisp autumn day. I am not at home. I am standing on a stage under the warm lights of the auditorium at the local university. The room is filled with students, faculty, and members of my community. Beside me stands a proud, nervous young woman, the first ever recipient of the Robert and Vivian Brooks Scholarship, a fund I established with the money recovered from Julian's offshore account. It is a fund for underprivileged students, a way to turn the money they tried to steal into a force for good, a way to honor my husband's belief in the power of education. I look out at the audience. In the front row I see my dear friend Martha, her face beaming with pride. Beside her sits my steadfast, loyal ally, Arthur Vance, looking dapper in a dark suit, a small satisfied smile on his face. My children Clara and David are there, their presence a warm, solid anchor in my life. I am safe. My home is my own again. My legacy, once threatened, is now secure, repurposed to create opportunity instead of funding a fantasy. As I look at the hopeful face of the young woman beside me, I reflect on the terrible cost of the battle I have just survived. The wound of my daughter's betrayal will never fully heal. But the fight has taught me something. It has taught me that strength is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it. It has taught me that the bonds of true loyalty and friendship are a treasure more valuable than any inheritance. I have been tested in the cruelest of fires. I have had to face the monstrous truth of what my own child was capable of. But I have not just survived, I have prevailed. I have protected the life and the legacy my husband and I built together. I have ensured that our life's work will not be a footnote in a story of greed and betrayal, but a prologue to countless stories of hope and success. The final nap they had planned for me will have to wait. I, Vivian, am still very much alive.